The iMac G4 was a stunning machine when it first released back in 2002, and it still is today. Unfortunately, the other aspects of the old G4 leave something to be desired. Luckily, there's a way to keep the beautiful design of the iMac G4, but actually give it a place in the modern household. I'll do my best to explain the process in the most straightforward way possible, so even if you don't have much soldering knowledge, you should still be able to do this mod. Before we start, I'll list off the things you'll need. You'll need some heat shrink tubing, a label maker, a soldering iron with a decently fine tip, some electrical tape, a pair of tweezers, a soldering stand, some male and female molex connectors, an assortment of wires. These can be taken from an old power supply if need be, some small connectors. These can be taken from another iMac or from another computer, but they have to closely match the connectors on the iMac. A hot glue gun. You'll also need some 743204004 DVI connectors, and some 1K ohm and 6K ohm resistors, although the 6K ohm resistors aren't 100% necessary. Now I will warn you, this project will cause irreparable damage to your iMac G4, so please only perform this on non-functioning units. And last but not least, I am not responsible for your safety. You will be working with mains power at times throughout this project, so please be careful. First, let's go through an overview of what we need to do to get the iMac to work as an external monitor. Hopefully this will give you an understanding of what needs to be done. I've made some schematics which you can see on the screen now. They will be linked below as well if you would like to look at them in a high resolution format. The first thing we need to do is modify the original iMac power supply so that it can detect when a computer is plugged in and then give power to the display. To do this, we need to cut off the original connector and replace it with a male molex connector. We will also need to delicately remove the connectors for both the display cables and the inverter, and then connect them to the power supply. Then we need to do some splicing with a resistor, which both activates the monitor and the power supply, and also tells the computer that something is connected. We will also need to connect each of the display wires to the DVI connector. This should be relatively easy as the pins on the display wires should fit snugly on each of the DVI pins, meaning no microsoldering is required. I've tried making this pinout as easy to follow as possible, but it still requires some explanation. The small box around each number corresponds to the color of the wire needed. The larger colored box around these boxes represents the color of the sleeve that they come from. For example, the green, red, and black wires that come from the green sleeve should connect to pins 17, 18, and 19 respectively. Now without further ado, let's get started. You're going to want to start by disassembling the machine almost completely. Remove everything until you can see the internal fan. The machine I'm using here has already been disassembled, so it is missing the internal drive assembly. Okay, now that we've got the iMac disassembled, we can start on removing the connectors on the display cables. If you're having trouble identifying the connector, it's the one with two cables that connect together at the end. Start with the metal shielding. Use some tweezers to pry it if you need to. I was fortunate and mine was already loose. Now you're going to want to get a needle. Use it to gently ply up the plastic tabs, keeping the contacts in place. Work your way all around the connector on both sides until there are no more clips. Okay, so now that all of the clips have been removed, you will need to gently pull all of the cables out. Make sure not to pull with too much force as not to damage the wires. Now that you've pulled off the connector, you should gently remove the wrappings that keep the two display wires together. Work your way around it with some tweezers and scissors when needed. Okay, so we're done with the display cables for now. Let's move on to the inverter. The process of removing the connector from the inverter wires is similar to the display wires, although it should be easier as the wires are larger. The inverter cable is easy to identify. It has a label on it marked inverter. Alright, that's the inverter done. Now let's get started on the power supply. I recommend you remove the power supply to work on it, but remember, working with exposed power supplies is dangerous. I don't recommend you work with it if you don't have much electrical knowledge. The first thing I want you to do with your power supply is to cut off the connector with a pair of scissors. We won't be needing it. Then, we need to pick any of the yellow and black wires. The rest can be left to the side or cut off. They aren't needed. We also need to separate the blue, green, and white wires. They then need to be connected to a male molex connector in this order: yellow to yellow, black and blue to black, white to the second black, and green to red. Once everything is connected and we have verified that our wiring is correct, we need to solder it and heat shrink it. The final result should look something like this. Now we're going to get back to work on our inverter wires. You should group the wires together in this order: black and green, blue and red, yellow, then orange and pink. Unfortunately, I forgot to hit record for this section, but what you're going to want to do is solder wires to both the red and blue and black and green pairs of wires. You're going to also want to cover them in heat shrink tubing. Now is when that 1K or 6K ohm resistor will come in handy. You need to solder it to the yellow wire. Now you're going to want to solder the green and black wires that we just soldered onto the inverter cable into a female molex connector. Just like the last one, red to green and black to black. Although make sure this black goes to your ground and not the white sense line on your power supply. If it helps, you can label each of the lines on the female connector so you can tell which wire is which. Great. Got all that? Awesome. Okay, this is where things start to get a bit tricky. Get your tweezers ready, because you will need them. Remember that resistor we soldered to the yellow inverter wire? Well, now we have to connect it to our DVI connector, on pin 14 to be precise. That's not all though. We also need to run a 1K ohm resistor between pin 14 and pin 16 on our DVI connector. I'll explain why. Pin number 14 supplies a 5V current from the connected computer. If we send that signal back through pin 16, we can make the computer think something is connected. We have to use a resistor though, to make the signal the correct voltage. We also need to use that 5V signal to turn on our power supply and backlights. This is where you'll need those small connectors that you've either salvaged from another iMac or from some other electronics. If you look here, you can see what has been done with the resistor. Okay, that's our resistor split done. We've almost got the backlights working. Now we need to move on to our grey display cable. This will be a similar process to the inverter cable. Let's start by grouping the wires. It should be grouped like this: blue, green, and grey for the first group, purple, orange, and yellow for the second group, and then pink, which looks a bit like red, white, and black for the third. Now you're going to want to solder wires to the first two groups. Black for the first, yellow for the second. The third group can be left loose for now. Now we need to connect these to our molex connector. The black wire connects to our ground, and the yellow wire should connect to our yellow/12 volt line. Warning: do not plug it into your 24 volt line. This will fry your LCD panel. Also, the wire coming from pin 14 on our DVI connector should also go to the white sense wire on our molex connector. This is the signal that activates the power supply. Now that that's done, we can start to heat shrink any of the solder joints that we're done with. I forgot to record it, but you should also run a wire from pin number 15 on your DVI connector to your ground line on your molex connector. Oof, well now what? Well, now she's ready to test. Plug in the power supply to your molex connector and then plug in your DVI connector to your computer and let's see what happens. And there you go. You should have fully functioning backlights now. Now we need to work on the display cables. Before we start with our fragile LVDS connectors, we should first heat shrink any exposed contacts that we no longer need. Although we will still need to connect a wire to pin 14, so make sure that you leave that wire accessible. Now that that's done, we can start to connect our individual LVDS wires to the DVI connector. The LVDS wires come from the last black cable that leaves our iMac. It looks like this, with 4 sets of sleeved wires. Each set is a different color. Let's grab the wires coming from the green sleeve and connect them to the top left row of the DVI pins. These are 17, 18, and 19. Start with the black and place it onto pin 19. Then the red, which would go onto pin 18. Lastly, green, which would go onto pin 17. That's the first set done. Now for the next set, which should be the wires coming from the blue sleeve. These will go in the same order as the ones we just did, on pins 9, 10, and 11. Now for the grey sleeve. These will again go below the 2 sets we just did, on pins 1, 2, and 3. In the same order, black, red, and green. Okay, only 1 set left. Now get the red sleeve. The black wire will plug onto pin 22, red on 23, and green on 24. Now it may get a bit cramped as it's right next to our resistor splice that we did on pins 14 to 16. Feel free to remove the splice from the DVI connector if you have trouble accessing it, but make sure that you remember what order the splice plugs in when you reconnect it. Now you can plug back in your resistor splice and your ground on pin 15. Make sure that you put everything back in correctly. Now remember our grey cable? We have 3 more wires that we have to plug in from that. These are the black, white and red wire. The black should plug into pin number 6 under our resistor splice. Then the white should go into pin number 7. As for the red, that should connect to pin number 14 along with the rest of the wires on that pin. I should point out that it doesn't have to connect directly to pin 14, as there is already a pin there, but you can connect it to the end of our resistor that is closest to that pin. You will need to solder it. Everything should look like this once it is done. I apologize for the camera not being properly in focus beforehand. Double check that all your wiring is correct and you should be good to test it. Once again, plug in your power supply and computer to see if it is detected. As you can see, everything appears to be working correctly. Give yourself a pat on the back if you've made it this far. All the hard stuff is behind us now. What we need to do is make sure that everything stays working, so get out the hot glue gun. Before we get gluing, clean up all of the wires so that they only come out in a single direction. Also, now is when you can heat shrink up any of the remaining exposed splices. Get the glue gun and start smothering all of your connectors in glue. You want to make sure that you get the hot glue in between all of the spaces between the wires, so they are properly fastened. Use as much glue as you like until you're comfortable that everything is secure. Once glued, feel free to wrap all of the wires in electrical tape so that they are reinforced. Now you can power it up for one last test. If everything works, you're done. You can start to close up your iMac. Make sure to reinstall the power supply in its ground. You can plug its molex connector in and its power connector. Also, you should reinstall the original super drive and hard drive assembly. This will give the machine its necessary weight so that it doesn't topple over. You can use a DVI to HDMI adapter to let you pass the video cable through one of the original I/O port holes. But if you don't have one, you can cut some of the plastic and fit a full-size DVI cable instead. Thanks for watching. I hope this guide was informative. I apologize if there are some mistakes in this video, but it's my first time piecing together so much information. I owe a big thank you to Dremel Junkie for making the original iMac G4 blogs. Without them, I would never have been inspired to try this kind of project for myself. I would never have had the right information to make this video. I don't want to take the credit for this, as ultimately I worked off of his guide to make my wiring diagrams. Please check out his blog if you want to see more iMac G4 stuff. If you're interested in seeing me make videos on how to convert the 15 and 17-inch iMac G4s, or other models of iMac, please let me know in the comments and support this video. Please like the video if you found it interesting, and follow me on Twitter if you want to stay up to date on the projects I'm working on. I hope you enjoyed watching. See you next time.